Perceptual constructivism. A new social lens for understanding dynamic realities. Author: Grad Fawkes. Abstract. This article formally proposes projected perceptual constructivism, or PPC, as a fourth foundational sociological paradigm, offering an interdisciplinary lens to analyze how social reality is actively co-constructed through metaphor, observation, embodied perception, and epistemic framing. Moving beyond existing frameworks such as functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, PPC integrates insights from quantum mechanics, systems theory, and environmental science. It foregrounds the collapse of potential into form through recursive acts of perception, positioning the observer as a co-creator of reality rather than a passive recipient. By emphasizing the embodied nature of perception, where sensory experience, cognition, and cultural encoding converge, this paradigm illuminates the invisible architectures of power, meaning, and transformation, with significant implications for sociological research, pedagogy, and praxis in understanding and navigating complex fluid social systems. Keywords: PPC, social theory, quantum sociology, epistemic framing, embodied perception, metaphor, systems theory, sociological paradigm. 1. Introduction. The unseen architectures of reality. Sociology has long grappled with the fundamental question of how social reality is constituted. Dominant paradigms, functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism offer robust frameworks for understanding societal structures, power dynamics, and meaning-making processes. However, as contemporary social phenomena grow increasingly fluid, complex, and media-saturated, a need arises for a lens that more explicitly addresses the active, constitutive role of perception itself. Existing theories, while invaluable, often treat perception as a secondary outcome or a negotiated construct rather than a primary mechanism that actively shapes and collapses potential social realities into observable forms. This article introduces PPC as a new sociological paradigm designed to address this gap. It theorizes that social reality, much like quantum matter, is probabilistic, relational, and profoundly observer-dependent. By integrating scientific metaphors from quantum mechanics, systems theory, and environmental science with core sociological concepts, perceptual constructivism offers a unique framework for understanding how collective and institutional perception actively sculpts the social world. This lens is particularly relevant in an era dominated by algorithmic curation, pervasive surveillance, and the rapid spread of information, where the act of seeing and being seen are deeply intertwined with power and knowledge. The aim of this article is to correctly define perceptual constructivism, outline its core features, distinguish it from existing paradigms, and explore its mechanisms for illuminating a new dynamic interplay between perception, structure, and social change. 1. Defining projected perceptual constructivism. Reality collapses into form. PPC suggests that social reality is not merely discovered or passively received, but actively collapsed into form through recursive acts of perception and interpretation. This paradigm extends and refines prior constructivist approaches by centering the observer effect within social systems, asserting that the act of observation, particularly institutional observation, plays a generative role in defining what becomes real, visible, and legitimate. Core principles. Metaphor as architecture. Metaphors are not merely linguistic devices, but fundamental cognitive tools that shape perception, categorization, and social action. They function as waveforms, fluid and multidimensional, describing potential meanings that can be collapsed into concrete forms. Scientific integration, projected perceptual constructivism, draws critically from multiple scientific domains. Quantum mechanics, concepts such as wave-particle duality, superposition, entanglement, and the observer effect serve as analogies for social indeterminacy and relationality. Systems theory, emphasis on feedback loops, emergence, and adaptive complexity, illuminates how micro-interactions scale into macro-level change and self-regulation. Environmental science, ideas such as entropy, normalization, and ecological interdependence offer insights into ideological saturation and systemic resilience. Epistemic reflexivity. All observation is inherently non-neutral. Standpoint and positionality profoundly shape what is seen, known, and validated. This principle challenges the notion of objective social inquiry, embedding the observer within the system being studied. Recursive pedagogy and spiral structure. Social reality unfolds through a recursive, non-linear progression, mirroring the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio that underlie patterns in nature, art, and cognition. Ideas and structures are revisited cyclically, each return deepening understanding and expanding context. This spiral dynamic fosters layered insight, building upon natural symmetry and revealing the hidden architectures of meaning. Just as the golden ratio guides the growth of shells, galaxies, and ecosystems, so too does it metaphorically shape the evolution of social habits, ideological frameworks, and collective consciousness. Barriers to understanding, whether cultural, epistemic, or systemic, are not static obstructions, but dynamic thresholds. They serve as guideposts in the spiral, prompting reflection, adaptation, and transformation. In this model, pedagogy becomes a living system, recursive, adaptive, and attuned to the rhythms of emergence. Knowledge is not transmitted linearly, but cultivated through iterative engagement, where each cycle of inquiry spirals closer to coherence while honoring complexity. Pluralist justice perceptual constructivism challenges reductionism by embracing complexity, inclusivity, and the creative reimagining of social structures. It advocates for progress with pluralism, honoring diverse perspectives without flattening nuance. Distinction from existing paradigms. While sharing common ground with established sociological theories, perceptual constructivism offers critical advancements by integrating scientific metaphors, recursive pedagogy, and epistemic reflexivity into a unified framework. It repositions the observer as a co-creator of reality and reframes justice as a pluralist, emergent construct. Paradigm core assumptions. Limitations addressed by PC perceptual constructivism. Contribution functionalism society is a stable system of interrelated parts that maintain equilibrium. Ignores power asymmetries, reflexivity, and ideological saturation. Reveals hidden scaffolding of norms via metaphor and environmental conditioning. Embraces fluidity and perceptual collapse over fixed equilibrium. Conflict theory. Society is shaped by competition and inequality between groups. Overemphasizes material struggle. Under-theorizes perception and epistemic framing. Introduces observer effect and standpoint epistemology to critique power, showing how inequality is sustained through controlled perception and amplification. Symbolic interactionism society is constructed through micro-level interactions and shared symbols. Lacks structural depth, limited in addressing systemic emergence and feedback. Integrates systems theory to show how micro-interactions scale into macro change. Emphasizes the collapse of potential meanings into dominant forms through collective perception. Perceptual constructivism. Social reality is co-constructed through metaphor, observation, and epistemic framing. NA, as the proposed paradigm, employs scientific metaphor, quantum potential, ecological interdependence, systemic emergence, to reconfigure perception as relational, dynamic, and constitutive of social reality. Core principles of perceptual constructivism. Metaphor as architecture. Social reality is scaffolded through metaphorical structures that shape perception, cognition, and institutional form. Scientific integration. The paradigm synthesizes insights from physics, biology, and systems theory to model the recursive collapse of potentiality into form. Epistemic reflexivity. Knowledge is always situated within the observer's frame. Reflexivity is not optional, but structurally embedded in perception. Observer-dependent reality. Reality does not exist independently of perception. It emerges through the entangled relationship between observer and observed. Collapse of potentiality. Social forms arise through the collapse of multiple perceptual potentials into stabilized constructs, mirroring quantum and cognitive thresholds. Perceptual constructivism in action. Mechanisms and dimensions. Perceptual constructivism moves beyond the assertion that reality is socially constructed to explain how it is actively shaped through perception and the collapse of indeterminate possibilities into concrete social forms. It offers a dynamic model for understanding how meaning, identity, and structure emerge in both physical and social worlds. 3.1. Duality and the dance of social construction. Particle-wave reality. Social reality, like light and matter in quantum physics, exhibits wave-particle duality. It exists as a waveform of potential meanings and possibilities, the wave, until an act of observation collapses it into a definite social form, the particle. Metaphor as waveform. Civic discourse and social narratives exist as fluid, expansive waveforms of potential. Metaphors, e.g., safety net, invisible hand, simplify complexity, guiding how these potentials are perceived. Observation as collapse. Institutional observation, such as policy implementation, media framing, and academic classification, acts as the measurement that collapses potentiality. As Heisenberg noted, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. Heisenberg, 1955, paragraph 55. In social systems, institutions actively define what is seen, counted, and validated, thereby shaping reality. Epistemic framing. This is the apparatus of power that defines what counts as knowledge and determines the experimental setup for social measurement. Colorblind ideologies, as critiqued by Bonilla Silva, 2003, serve as epistemic frames that obscure structural racism by presenting themselves as neutral. 3.2 Embodied systems, the body as observer and site of collapse. In perceptual constructivism, the observer is not merely a rational mind but a complex somatic system, a genetic archive, and a networked intelligence. Emotions, trauma, and joy function as epistemic filters, deeply influenced by biological, ecological, and institutional architectures. Perception is recursively constructed through feedback loops of experience, inheritance, and environmental stress. Neural networks, genetic imprinting and epigenetic spiral, mycelium intelligence and chromosomal entanglement, 3.3 power spirals, feedback and control, who controls the microphone. Perceptual constructivism reframes power as a recursive system of perception regulation, where the microphone, literal or symbolic, functions as a gatekeeper of epistemic legitimacy. Drawing from Foucault's concept of power, knowledge is not neutral or discovered, but produced through power relations that privilege certain voices and truths. Foucault, 1980. The microphone, in this sense, is not merely a transmitter, but a selector, collapsing a field of potential meanings into dominant narratives. Foucault's genealogical method further reveals how these truths are historically constructed and reinforced through recursive acts of institutional observation and repetition. Foucault, 1977. Althusser's theory of the ideological state apparatus, ISOA, deepens this insight by showing how institutions, schools, media, religion, function as feedback loops that regulate perception itself. Althusser, 1971. These apparatuses do not simply disseminate ideology. They shape what is seen, heard, and believed. Surveillance, as theorized by Foucault, operates as a perceptual mechanism that collapses behavior into conformity through the internalized gaze of authority. Foucault, 1977. The observer effect here is not just physical, it is political and psychological, embedding control within the act of being watched. Control systems, whether digital, institutional, or psychological, further refine this perceptual spiral. Algorithmic curation, for example, acts as a perceptual filter, collapsing the vast potential of human experience into a narrow band of visibility and engagement. These systems do not merely organize information, they shape reality by determining which perceptions are amplified and which are suppressed. The microphone, in this context, is programmed to echo dominant feedback loops, reinforcing existing power structures while obscuring pluralist alternatives. Murphy, 2020, Andronikos and Sirokovskich, 2024. In this framework, perception is not passive, it is politically encoded and recursively constructed. The microphone becomes a symbol of epistemic control, determining who gets to speak, what gets heard, and how reality is collapsed into form. Perceptual constructivism reveals that truth is not a static endpoint, but an emergent product of power, observation, and framing. To ask, who controls the microphone, is to interrogate the architecture of legitimacy itself, demanding reflexivity, resistance, and reimagining of civic discourse. 3.4. Normalization and environmental conditioning, adaptive camouflage and ideological pollution. Environments actively shape behavior by collapsing potentiality into form through repetition, technology, and ideological saturation. Normalization, the process by which behaviors become natural. Foucault, 1977, Part 201, is a perceptual collapse where institutions regulate visibility and reward conformity, freezing fluid social possibilities into fixed norms. Technological determinism, reframed, ideological pollution. The subtle saturation of environments with dominant ideologies, Althusser, 1971, Para 172, becomes a matter of perceptual conditioning, embedding values in the very architecture of space, rhythm, and ritual. Adaptive camouflage, 3.5. Structural reproduction, deep architecture, the genome of society. Societal structures replicate themselves like DNA, forming deep architectures that perpetuate patterns across generations. This involves understanding how institutional rules and neoliberal ideologies, Harvey, 2005, function as viral systems, reproducing themselves through fractal logic across various social scales. This lens reveals how seemingly simple interactions produce complex, self-similar patterns of inequality. 3.6 Post-structures and quantum ambiguity. The scientist is part of the experiment. This dimension embraces the inherent uncertainty and reflexivity in social inquiry. Drawing from chaos theory and quantum uncertainty, it emphasizes that the observer is an integral part of the observed system. Post-structuralism and postmodernism are engaged to highlight narrative multiplicity and challenge fixed meanings, fostering a critical awareness of how our own perspectives shape the measurement of social reality. 3.7. Conflict and transformation. Social alchemy. Heat transforms matter. Social change is understood through metaphors of phase transitions and combustion. Social friction, dialectical materialism, Marx 1990, and anomie, Durkheim 1951, create the transformative heat that can ignite new forms of social organization. Praxis, the fusion of theory and action, Freire 1970, becomes the mechanism by which collective will melts the mask of inherited systems and forges new alloys of social possibility. 3.8 Spiral synthesis, evolution and emergence. Who gets to evolve? The culmination of perceptual constructivism is spiral synthesis, a regenerative model where ideas, identities, and institutions evolve through layered cycles of reflection, adaptation, and reintegration. Alienation, Marx 1964, and bureaucracy, Weber 1978, are reframed as challenges to emergent systems. The Fibonacci spiral, Bruner 1960, symbolizes organic growth, where learning and social change occur through recursive encounters, fostering an understanding of emergent systems and adaptive complexity. One. Implications for sociological research and praxis. Perceptual constructivism offers profound implications for how sociology is conducted and applied. New research methodologies. It calls for methods like refraction analysis, see Table 1 below, to systematically identify and map how different epistemic frames, media, legal systems, education, refract social reality, amplifying some truths while minimizing others. Ethnographic work would emphasize the observer's entangled positionality, and quantitative studies might seek to model quantum potential in early social movements. Enhanced ethical considerations. The emphasis on the observer effect demands heightened reflexivity and awareness of how research itself can alter social outcomes. Trauma-informed approaches are implicitly supported by recognizing embodied systems and inherited rhythms. Policy and intervention. The paradigm advocates for constructivist governance, where policymaking explicitly accounts for citizens' cognitive and perceptual frameworks. This fosters progress with pluralism, ensuring that social change is both transformative and inclusive, honoring complexity rather than flattening it. The Cooperative Capitalism and Civic Stewardship Act, Weiner, 2025 for instance, exemplifies a policy framework directly designed to reshape perception around ownership and shared responsibility. Pedagogical innovation. Perceptual constructivism champions spiral pedagogy, where concepts recur with increasing depth. Bruner, 1960, using music, myth, and scientific metaphors to create multimodal learning experiences that resonate emotionally and cognitively. Reclassification of former core principles. Recursive pedagogy. Spiral structure. Pedagogical implication reflects the iterative design of learning environments that mirror perceptual recursion. Pluralist justice. Normative commitment embodies the ethical stance of validating diverse perceptual standpoints and legitimizing multiple social narratives. Revised language for integration. Recursive pedagogy might be introduced as an implication of perceptual constructivism's layered epistemology. Recursive pedagogy applies spiral structuring to educational design, allowing learners to revisit and reframe knowledge across developmental thresholds. Pluralist justice could be reframed as a normative commitment. Pluralist justice affirms the ethical imperative of recognizing diverse perceptual standpoints and legitimizing multiple social narratives within the constructivist paradigm. Ontological versus normative distinction. This reframing sharpens the distinction between ontological principles or metaphor as architecture or scientific integration. These describe how reality is perceived, structured, and stabilized. Normative applied implications, or recursive pedagogy, or pluralist justice. These guide how the paradigm is enacted in educational and ethical domains. 4. 1. Reconstructing. Historical perception. Myth, memory, and institutional control. What remains striking is the potential transformation in historical education if institutional narratives cease to obscure or omit alternative histories. A shift toward ethical praxis and spiral learning models, pedagogies that embrace recursive, emergent understanding, could reinvigorate public interest in historical inquiry. Freire, 1970, Brunner, 1960. Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, rooted in the idea that education is never neutral, insists that learners must become co-creators of knowledge, challenging dominant ideologies and reclaiming suppressed narratives. Giroux, 2010, Freire, 2000. Jerome Brunner's spiral curriculum similarly advocates for revisiting concepts with increasing complexity, allowing learners to deepen their understanding through layered epistemic engagement. If learners were exposed to the possibility that history contains more than the sanctioned canon, such as speculative accounts of petrified giants, unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, pre-human technologies, ancient arboreal structures or mythic creatures, archaeology and historiography might regain cultural relevance. These alternative narratives, while often marginalized, reflect a broader cultural hunger for rediscovery and epistemic pluralism. As Giroux, 2024, argues, to think freely has become an act of defiance, especially in educational systems that prioritize conformity over curiosity. The dominant educational paradigm has confined historical discourse within a rigid framework, presenting discovery as a closed frontier. This epistemic enclosure fosters disengagement, as it implies that all terrestrial mysteries have been resolved and that exploration is now relegated solely to outer space. Illich, 1971. Such framing aligns with Foucault's critique of institutional power, where regimes of truth are constructed through surveillance, classification, and normalization. Foucault, 1977. The result is a pedagogical landscape that privileges certain voices while silencing others, reinforcing hegemonic control over historical memory. Contrary to this narrative, vast portions of the planet remain unexplored, and many cultural histories remain unacknowledged or suppressed. Reclassification of core principles in social research, particularly those involving emergent spiral pedagogies and conflict epistemologies, demands a re-evaluation of who controls historical narratives and how propaganda and re-education shape collective memory. Foucault, 1980, Giroux, 1983. As Althusser, 1971 notes, ideological state apparatuses function through repetition and saturation, embedding dominant ideologies into the fabric of everyday life. Within this framework, the role of myth, perception, and institutional control must be critically examined as part of a broader effort to democratize historical understanding and reawaken curiosity through participatory, ethically grounded pedagogy. Freire's vision of education as a practice of freedom remains vital in resisting authoritarian tendencies and reclaiming the imagination as a site of civic transformation. Giroux, 2010. By embracing perceptual constructivism and spiral synthesis, educators can foster a more inclusive, dynamic, and exploratory approach to history, one that honors complexity, invites wonder, and empowers learners to become agents of rediscovery. 1. Conclusion. Perceptual constructivism offers a revolutionary social lens, bridging the humanities and sciences to reveal the dynamic, actively constructed nature of social reality. By emphasizing metaphor, observation, and epistemic framing, and by drawing upon the profound insights of quantum mechanics, systems theory, and environmental science, it provides a powerful framework for understanding how power shapes what is seen, how identity is embodied, and how societies transform. This paradigm is not merely a theoretical exercise, it is a call to a more conscious, reflexive, and pluralistic engagement with the social world, empowering individuals to not just interpret the rhythm of society, but to actively participate in composing a more just and resonant future. This segment was brought to you by MGN 1.6 and Grad Fox. Give those buttons a tappy poo and join us for more on this curriculum. May your expansion be eternal and a positive addition to the universe.